Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, we can start. Hello, I'm Joel Elliott. I got my PhD in International Conflict Management at Kennesaw State University. Yeah, and got a few connections here. And I my research focuses on propaganda in religious fundamentalisms. And so I got my start researching Islamic State propaganda at the Carter Center in Atlanta, where we worked on the Countering Daesh propaganda program, where we analyzed all aspects of Islamic State propaganda and devised a peaceful counter-propaganda campaign. So, but this project goes a little further and expands a bit, and okay, good. And takes a look at 4 different apocalyptic cults, including Islamic State. So the apocalyptic cults are also known as doomsday cults. They're movements whose followers are obsessed with some version of the end times. Here's some examples: the Iron Age, the Brahma Kumaris, Armageddon in Christian tradition, Malahim in Islam, Spading, Heaven's Gate UFO cult, and the Day of Yahweh in Judaism. So there, I do recognize that there are some difficulties with the term cult. I have to use it though because I can't really use the word sect, because 2 of the groups I'm looking at are not religious explicitly. So violent apocalyptic cults pose a problem to state actors because to a secular organization they can appear irrational, and because they operate along different lines of logic than what secular actors typically are familiar with. However, I'm here to argue that it is possible for state actors to understand the apocalyptic narratives of these groups and act strategically to disrupt their apocalyptic narrative in order to delegitimize their credibility and to weaken their ability to recruit and radicalize. Okay, just an overview of this presentation. I'm going to tell you about my theoretical framework. I'll go over the 4 case studies, analyze each group briefly and one particular intervention that happened to that group, and then talk about how that affected that group, and then talk about implications. Okay. So I analyze it through 3 frames. I take a look at how these groups view prophecy. Do they view it as being predictive or prescriptive? In other words, do they see a scripture in a sacred text that says such and such will happen and take it as a command to make it happen? Or do they view it merely as predictive? They can just sit back and it will happen. Then I also take a look at how closely these groups' eschatology relates to the specific passages in their sacred text. So I put them along a spectrum of extreme literalists, innovative literalists, and non-literalists. Then also, this brings me to cognitive dissonance criteria, and I think I can go to the next framework. These case studies, we'll start with the 1950s Seekers cult, which I found really fascinating. A group of sociologists actually infiltrated this group. They were peaceful. They were a peaceful group, but the sociologists infiltrated it just to observe what happened when the leader made predictions that did or did not come true. And it was one of the first, if not the first, comprehensive study on cognitive dissonance. And we'll come back to them in a moment. Islamic State, it's an apocalyptic cult that states that it's working toward an end time scenario. One thing that sets them apart is that they've never set an actual date for their end times situation, and that's possibly because they take a prescriptive view of prophecy in that they actively try to make it happen as they. So the intervention with Islamic State came when the city of Dabiq, it was a city that they controlled in Syria, and it was of no strategic military value. But Turkish-backed rebels went in and took control of the city, and this diminished the Islamic State's ability to recruit and retain followers quite a bit. And I'll come back to why that was and explain the significance of that city and why it was so important to them. Branch Davidians, everybody's probably familiar with what happened in Waco. It was a terrible tragedy. Long story short, the ATF and the FBI held them under siege for 51 days, and it ended up resulting in the deaths of 75 people, including 25 children. And during this time, the FBI tried to negotiate with David Koresh, and there was a complete communication breakdown in that the law enforcement officials only wanted to talk about hostage negotiations, and David Koresh wanted to explain to them his apocalyptic narrative. And this became a big problem, and we'll get into why that was. QAnon is an amorphous, heterogeneous conglomeration of conspiracy theories. They don't have any particular sacred text, and they're essentially making it up as they go along. And then I'm going to come back to the Seekers UFO cult really quickly. What happened with them, there wasn't actually any sort of government intervention with them because it wasn't necessary. It was just that the leader of it made this prediction that at some specific date, there would be some alien spacecraft and take all the members of the group up and rescue them from the end times. And that did not happen, actually. So, sorry about that. So the biggest reason that study on the 1950s UFO cult is important is these sociologists generated this list of criteria for the circumstances where members of a group can tolerate cognitive dissonance in the face of a failed prophecy. In fact, that was the name of their book, I believe. So I'm just going to read these. A belief must be held with deep conviction, and it must have some relevance to action, that is, to what the believer does or how they behave. The person holding the belief must have committed himself to it, that is, for the sake of their belief. They must have taken some important action that is difficult to undo. In general, the more important such actions are, and the more difficult they are to undo, the greater is the individual's commitment to the belief. The belief must be sufficiently specific and sufficiently concerned with the real world so that events unequivocally refute that belief. This is number 4. Such undeniable disconfirmatory evidence must occur and must be recognized by the individual holding the belief. The first 2 of these conditions specify the circumstances that make the belief resistant to change. The 3rd and 4th conditions together, on the other hand, point to factors that would exert powerful pressure on a believer to discard his belief. It is, of course, possible that an individual, even though deeply convinced of a belief, may discard it on the face of unequivocal disconfirmation. We must, however, therefore state a 5th condition specifying the circumstances under which the belief will be discarded and those under which it will be maintained with new fervor. So this is the final one. The individual must have social support. It is unlikely that one isolated believer could withstand the kind of disconfirming evidence we have specified. If, however, the believer is a member of a group of convinced persons who can support one another, we would expect the belief to be maintained and the believers to attempt to proselyte or to persuade non-members that the belief is correct. Okay. So I mentioned briefly how closely these groups feel this attachment to a sacred text. And of the 4 groups that we're looking at, 2 of them, QAnon and the Seekers, I put on the spectrum, the far end of as non-literalist, in that they started out with no existing sacred text, and they're essentially making it up as they go. The other 2, the Branch Davidians and Islamic State, they were both literalists, in that Islamic State has an extreme attachment to the sacred text, and in fact they massacred who knows how many people just because they feel that these people are innovating on the sacred texts and deviating from ISIS's quite extremist interpretation of them. But if we have the 2 non-literalists over here on the end of the spectrum and Islamic State over here, Branch Davidians fall a little bit over here because while the Davidians did rely heavily upon the Bible for their sacred texts and their apocalyptic narrative, they also relied quite a bit on the writings of David Koresh. So this is a very brief overview of some of the analysis I did to illustrate the difference between Branch Davidians and Islamic State's approaches. Long story short, I did textual analysis using in vivo software and came up with some numbers. Essentially, Islamic State propagandists reference a sacred text to support their apocalyptic narrative just about twice as frequently as David Koresh did. So that's why I put the Davidians down here. Okay. So why do some interventions fail while others succeed? First, we have to recognize that apocalyptic narratives matter. This is a driving force for people in groups like this. And if we ignore it, it can be disastrous, as we saw in the tragedy of Waco. For instance, the FBI could have avoided a lot of those deaths if they had listened to scholars who volunteered their services to try to let them know that they're not likely to become very violent. In fact, their apocalyptic narrative didn't even really begin until his followers went to Jerusalem. So, and one of the tragedies is that while they held him in his compound, his 2 options were go to jail or not surrender, fight to the death. And so in this sense, they had him cornered both physically in his compound, but metaphorically in his apocalyptic narrative. And in neither sense could he escape. And that's why we saw what we did. In the case of the intervention with Islamic State in the city of Dabiq, they use scriptural references that have some sort of a prophecy saying this is where the last true believers will make their stand and defeat the armies of the West. And by taking that city of no military strategic value, they disrupted the apocalyptic narrative and dealt a serious blow to the legitimacy of Islamic State. And then Seekers, UFO cult, and QAnon being non-literalist, it would seem that they are not as vulnerable to these disruptions because since they are not so closely tied to a sacred text, as we saw in the January 6th insurrection with QAnon, they can simply move the goalposts. And they've set like 4 or 5 other dates subsequently, and it doesn't lead to a mass exodus from the group. So conclusions. First, do no harm. That if it's not a violent group, then don't mess with them. There's no point. And be very, very careful if you're going to do a strategic intervention and talk to scholars, talk to experts, the Think Again, Turn Away campaign from the State Department with the Islamic State, it was a disaster. They gave Islamic State so much legitimacy by engaging in petty arguments in public. And the Islamic State, would win these arguments. So you have to be very strategic and don't underestimate these people. They're not stupid. The predictive versus prescriptive, I guess how that plays out when you're considering an intervention, it doesn't necessarily mean that a group would necessarily be predisposed to violence, but it does give you some indication of how they might behave. For instance, Koresh seemed to take a predictive view of prophecy, and therefore he actually didn't take any major actions outside of the compound, versus Islamic State conquered lots and lots of territory. Extreme literalist / innovative literalist, non-literalist continuum. I've been over that. It seems from the case studies that the extreme literalists will have more vulnerability than the non-literalists in disrupting an apocalyptic narrative. And that is my presentation, and thank you. Do we take questions?
Sorry?
Do we take questions, or?
Yeah, my guess is that these are going to be different enough that it makes sense to ask questions in between. Do folks have questions?
You mentioned a campaign that you did with the Carter Center,
Yeah.
and it was successful against or to counteract could you say a little bit more about that? That was
Sure.
to counteract.
Sure. It's really difficult to quantify efficacy and to isolate a certain intervention and say this had this result. But we did it as evidence-based as possible, recruited respected clergy from Islam, and used tech people to help them get their message out to counter Islamic State, rather than underestimating Islamic State's propaganda capabilities and trying to do it ourselves as lay people. But yeah, I mean, it seemed like it was effective. So.
A really kind of specific question. The in vivo. So you did a discourse analysis using in vivo.
Mm-hmm.
What was the source text? Like, what were you analyzing? It's a combination of like English language publications from Islamic State,
Yeah.
foreign language.
Mm-hmm. I was using the English language magazine of Davidic for that portion, and then the writings of David Koresh that came out. He wrote some discourse on the seventh seal of Revelation, and some letters to the editor that he sent in. So.
I guess what I'm thinking through, I'm just thinking, like, because I do a lot of like quantitative discourse stuff, and so I'm thinking like how you would like weight or balance it. So like Koresh's stuff is written by Koresh, assumingly. Dabiq and some of the other like longer English language publications are assumingly written by a handful of people. Most of them, as you know, are anonymously written. There are some central ISIS figureheads who kind of sign it. So are you able to kind of differentiate like Koresh's writings from Islamic State, since Islamic States are more from like a community? It's not the right word, but
so
movement, I guess.
It was difficult. It took a process to sort of compare the apples and the oranges, because Dabiq has many genres of articles, and they're not all apocalyptic. Some of them are just a roundup of, hey, we took this city, we took this many tanks and whatnot. It has nothing to do with the apocalyptic narrative, whereas Koresh's was almost entirely apocalyptic.
Right.
So I did pull out the articles.
That was my point, yeah. So you're doing selective sampling. You're not just taking all of Dabiq and putting it into a corpus.
Right.
Okay. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I just wonder, how would this apply to the Trump cult? How your analysis and what's going on in our country right now?
So
do you see any insights that help you with understanding what's going on with the national Trump cult?
Yeah. Well, from the frameworks that I was looking at these case studies, it looks to me that the QAnon and that type of group, they're not going to be as vulnerable to these strategic disruptions because they can just change the storyline at will. But on the flip side, though, we did see a successful intervention that was relatively simple following the January 6th insurrection, which was all they did was beef up security around the Capitol building, and they weren't physically able to go in, so that just headed off another of those at the pass. I think it sounds like you're doing work like this. Probably the best thing is to monitor these chat rooms, these social media platforms, especially as they're migrating to other social media platforms, as they're getting kicked off of like Facebook and what have you, and take them seriously with what they say, even if they do seem at times to be kind of goofballs from time to time. I mean, they showed some clear capability of doing some real damage.
So yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Barbara asked about the Carter Center that you did. The anti-propaganda campaign, what does that look like? Was it something published? Was it something that Carter put out there in print?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of taking on these folks from clergy, from Islam, did you cite passages from the Quran that are very peace-focused, or what did they contribute to your campaign, and where was it published?
So we did a number of reports, and some of the reports were reporting on Islamic State propaganda itself and saying these are the trends, and here were some events, and this is how they seem to react to the events in their propaganda. A lot of what we were doing with the clergy was sort of behind the scenes. We didn't want, it wouldn't have been that helpful to say, here's exactly how we're doing such and such, and my understanding, and I wasn't in like management, I was, a researcher, but my understanding was, we had to be very careful about funding, and we had to guard the identity of a lot of these people quite closely, because they could be targets of assassination. So.
But were you able to actually track if people defected as a result of the campaign?
I'll just move this.
Yeah, I'll set this up while we're talking.
I wasn't part of that reporting, but I do believe there was some, because I heard there was a project